The day my father-in-law laughed at me in front of the entire board of directors, I was wearing a blazer I'd bought secondhand from a thrift store on the corner of 5th and Monroe. It still had someone else's dry cleaning tag tucked inside the collar. I never removed it. I figured if they were going to underestimate me anyway, I might as well lean into it. He pointed at me, actually pointed, index finger extended like I was something stuck to the bottom of his shoe, and said, "You really came here today? Without a lawyer? Without anything?" And then he laughed. Not a small laugh. The kind that fills a room and bounces off the walls and makes other people laugh too, even when they don't know why. I looked down at my notes. I looked at the mahogany table that had probably cost more than my entire apartment. I looked at my hands, which were completely still. I had known this moment was coming for 2 years. Let me go back to the beginning, because if I start in the middle, you'll think I was always this calm. I wasn't. I married my husband 6 years ago. We met at a university alumni event. He was charming in the way that men who grow up with money often are. Effortless and easy, like nothing in the world has ever truly cost them anything. His name was Stuart. I called him Stu sometimes just to watch him wince. He hated that. His family owned Halcyon Group, a mid-sized commercial real estate development company that his grandfather had built from nothing in the 1970s. By the time I entered the picture, it had grown into something worth just under $400 million. The company held properties in 6 states. His father, who everyone called the chairman, though his actual title was CEO, ran it with a kind of quiet iron grip that he disguised as mentorship. His mother was the kind of woman who coordinates her handbag with her coffee cup. She once told me at Christmas dinner in front of everyone at the table that she had hoped Stuart would marry someone with more polish. She said it like a compliment with the edges filed off, like she was doing me a favor by being honest. I smiled. I cut my turkey. I said, "I appreciate that." My own mother, who had passed 2 years before I met Stuart, had been a bookkeeper at a small manufacturing company for 23 years. She kept 3 jobs at once when I was in middle school. She taught me how to read a balance sheet before I knew how to drive. She used to say that numbers don't lie, but the people who arrange them do. She was right. I didn't know how right until I married into Halcyon. I worked in private equity before the marriage. Not the flashy kind, the quiet kind, the fund of funds kind, where you sit in a room with spreadsheets for 12 hours and emerge knowing exactly which assets are undervalued and why. I was good at it. My managing director once told me I had the best eye for distressed assets she'd ever seen. After the wedding, Stuart's father, I'll call him the chairman because that's what he was to me, never anything warmer, suggested I step back from my career. Not asked. Suggested, which in that family meant decided. He said it wouldn't look right for the daughter-in-law of Halcyon Group to be working for a competing investment firm. He said it with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Stuart thought it was a reasonable request. I should have listened to the part of me that went cold the moment it was said. So I stepped back. I freelanced. I consulted quietly on the side. I kept my licenses current. I kept my contacts warm. And for 3 years I watched. I watched how the chairman made decisions. I watched which board members he trusted and which ones he managed. I watched the annual reports, which were public. And I noticed the numbers that felt slightly off, the kind of off you only notice if you spent a decade staring at asset valuations for a living. A subsidiary in Nevada that was technically profitable but whose margins were too thin given the square footage. A property acquisition in Georgia that was listed at a price that made no sense relative to market comparables at the time of purchase. I mentioned it to Stuart once. He told me I was overthinking. He told me his father had been doing this for 30 years and I had been doing whatever it is you used to do for 4. That was the first time I understood exactly what kind of marriage I was in. The second time was 18 months later when I found the document. I wasn't looking for it. I want to be clear about that because later everyone assumed I had been snooping. I was looking for our homeowner's insurance renewal in the filing cabinet in the home office we shared, the office with the built-in shelves that had been designed for Stuart's books but were mostly mine by that point. I pulled the wrong folder. Inside was a single-page summary of an amendment to the Halcyon Group operating agreement that had been executed 14 months earlier. It had my name on it. Specifically, it had a signature that was supposed to be mine, agreeing to a voluntary reduction in the equity stake I had received as a marital gift from the chairman when Stuart and I married, a 2% ownership interest in Halcyon Group, which his lawyers had structured as a personal gift rather than a marital asset. At the time of signing, that 2% had been worth approximately $8 million. The signature was not mine. I recognized this immediately because I have unusually small handwriting. My lowercase letters are nearly the same height as my uppercase ones, a habit I developed in school when I was taught by a teacher who docked points for messy penmanship. My signature on this document had perfectly proportioned lettering. Lovely, even. Nothing like mine. I photographed the document with my phone. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it. I closed the filing cabinet. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea. I sat down at the table, and I thought for a very long time. Then I called the only person I trusted completely, my former managing director, a woman I'll call my mentor, who had moved to a boutique advisory firm after leaving the fund. I told her what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Don't say anything to anyone, don't react, come see me Tuesday." I said okay. I didn't sleep much that night, but I wasn't crying. I was thinking. My mentor connected me with a forensic documents examiner and a securities attorney. The examiner confirmed within 3 weeks that the signature was forged. The attorney told me that depending on how the rest of the operating agreement was structured, the forged amendment could be a criminal matter in addition to a civil one. She used words like securities fraud and shareholder misrepresentation in the same calm tone you'd use to discuss the weather. I asked her what I should do. She said, "That depends on what you want." I told her I wanted the truth on the record. I wanted my equity restored. And I wanted whoever had authorized this to understand that I was not, in fact, the woman they had spent 5 years managing. She said, "Okay, but this will take time, and you cannot move on the marriage until we're ready." That was 2 years before the boardroom. 2 years of dinners. 2 years of holidays. 2 years of my mother-in-law making comments about my shoes and my father-in-law asking Stuart, in my presence, about the business side of things, as though I weren't sitting right there with a decade of investment experience and a forensic examiner's report saved in 3 separate encrypted files. 2 years of being underestimated and choosing, every single time, to let it happen. During those 2 years, I was not idle. My mentor and I had structured a quiet acquisition fund, a small LLC registered in Delaware, capitalized by 3 former colleagues of mine who understood distressed assets and had no connection whatsoever to Stuart or his family. Over 14 months, we acquired Halcyon Group's outstanding convertible notes, the ones the company had issued in 2021 to fund an expansion that had not gone as planned. The notes were trading at a discount. Nobody on the Halcyon board had bothered to track who was buying them because the positions were small and spread across several holding entities. Nobody ever looked at who owned the holding entities. By the time my attorney was ready to move, my fund held approximately 19% of Halcyon Group's outstanding convertible notes. Under the terms of the note indenture, terms that had been written by the chairman's own law firm, default on the interest payments for 2 consecutive quarters triggered an automatic conversion event, and Halcyon had in fact missed 2 consecutive interest payments. Quietly, the kind of quietly that only works when you assume no one is paying attention. I had been paying attention. The conversion would give my fund slightly under 12% of Halcyon Group's equity, combined with the 2% stake that had been fraudulently amended away from me, which my attorney was prepared to challenge. I would hold a controlling minority position, not majority, but enough. More than enough to demand a seat at the table. More than enough to force a special meeting of the board. I filed the conversion notice on a Tuesday morning. I filed the civil complaint about the forged document on the same day, at the same time, in 2 different courthouses. Stuart called me 4 hours later. He didn't say hello. He said, "What did you do?" Not a question. A statement, the kind men make when they realize the thing they underestimated has teeth. I said, "I think you should talk to your father." The special board meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks later. My attorney and I had demanded it under the terms of the operating agreement, something the chairman's lawyers scrambled to contest but couldn't. because the operating agreement said what it said. My father-in-law spent 2 weeks trying to negotiate a private settlement. His first offer was to restore my equity stake and pay a modest sum in exchange for withdrawing the conversion and dropping the civil complaint. I declined. His second offer was substantially larger. He sent it through Stuart, which I found telling. It meant he was already worried about optics. A husband delivering his wife a settlement offer at the kitchen table is a very different picture than two opposing attorneys meeting at a conference room. I declined again. My sister-in-law, Stuart's younger sister, who had always been politely distant with me in the way that people are when they're uncertain whether to like you, called me the night before the board meeting. She had clearly been put up to it. She said, "I just want you to know that whatever happened, this is going to hurt a lot of people who don't deserve it." I thought about my mother. I thought about her balance sheets and her 3 jobs and the dry cleaning tag in my thrift store blazer. I thought about the Christmas dinner and my mother-in-law's comment about polish. I said, "I understand," and I meant it. I did understand. I just wasn't going to stop. The morning of the board meeting, I arrived 20 minutes early. I wore the second-hand blazer. I did not remove the dry cleaning tag. My attorney arrived a moment after me, along with the forensic examiner and a partner from a second law firm I had retained specifically for securities matters. 3 people who were very good at what they did, sitting quietly at one end of the table. The chairman walked in at 5 past the hour. He was flanked by 2 of his own attorneys and 2 board members who I knew were his closest allies. He looked at our end of the table and he smiled the way men smile when they're performing confidence rather than feeling it. Then he looked at me specifically and he laughed. He said, "You really came here today? Without an army? Without anything substantial?" His lead attorney cleared her throat slightly, just slightly, a tiny involuntary sound, and I noticed it. I filed it away. I said, "I came with everything I need." He said something else after that, something about me not understanding how these things actually worked, something about how his family had built something real and I had contributed nothing to it. I let him finish. I let the room settle. And then my attorney placed a stack of documents in the center of the table, and my securities partner opened her laptop and began walking through the conversion notice, the note indenture terms, the payment default history, and the equity schedule as it now stood. The chairman's lead attorney went very still, not still like she was listening. Still like she was recalculating. I watched her read the first 3 pages of the note conversion analysis, and I watched the moment she understood. She was a professional and professionals don't show much, but there was a half-second where her jaw shifted slightly, the way it does when a number doesn't match what you thought you knew, and she looked up from the page and looked at me, and what she said, quietly, almost to herself, was, "She holds the notes." The chairman said, "What?" She said it again, louder. "She holds the notes, or an entity she controls does." She was looking at the equity schedule now. "If this conversion is valid, it's valid," my securities partner said pleasantly. The room went quiet in a way that boardrooms almost never do. There's always some ambient noise, someone shifting in their chair, a phone buzzing somewhere, the building's HVAC system doing whatever it does. For about 4 seconds I heard none of that. Then the chairman looked at me, not with laughter, not with the performed confidence he'd walked in with something I recognized from all those dinners and all those holidays and all those moments of being managed and overlooked and politely diminished. He recognized me, finally, as what I actually was. The civil case regarding the forged document was settled 6 weeks after the board meeting. The terms are confidential, but my equity was fully restored, plus the value that had accrued in the period between the forgery and the restoration. My attorney was very pleased with the outcome. I was less interested in the money than in the thing that happened before the settlement was signed. My father-in-law, in a private session with both legal teams present, had to formally acknowledge that the amendment had not been executed with my knowledge or consent. He did not look at me when he said it. I looked at him the entire time. My marriage ended 2 months later amicably, in the way that things end when both people know the premise of the relationship has been fully revealed. Stuart did not fight anything. I think he was relieved in a way to be done pretending. He moved back into the family house. I kept the apartment that he had always considered too small for us both. I loved that apartment. I love the way light comes through the kitchen window in the afternoon. I love that everything in it is mine. My mother-in-law sent me a card after the divorce was finalized. There was no letter inside, just her signature and a single printed line that had clearly been factory selected from the card company's options. I looked at it for a moment, and then I put it in the recycling bin. I thought about sending her a note back. Something brief. I drafted several versions in my head over the following weeks. But I never sent anything, because I realized eventually that she already knew everything she needed to know. She had watched it happen. She had been in that boardroom. She had seen her husband unable to look at me, and she had seen me look at him without flinching. That was enough. That was, honestly, more than enough. People ask me sometimes, friends mostly, and a few former colleagues who have heard pieces of the story, whether I feel guilty about the way I did it. The patience of it, the 2 years of letting them believe they had managed me successfully, of sitting through dinners and absorbing comments about polish and contributing nothing, of watching and waiting and building something they couldn't see. I think about that question. I think about the document with the forged signature. I think about the conversation where my father-in-law suggested I step back from my career, and the way Stuart nodded like it was already decided, and the Christmas dinner comment, and all the quarterly reports with the slightly off numbers that I mentioned once, and was dismissed for. I think about my mother and her balance sheets. I don't feel guilty. But I do feel something that's harder to name. Something like grief, maybe, for the marriage I had believed I was entering, and the family I had thought I was joining. I had wanted it to be real. For a while, I had tried very hard to make it real. That's the part nobody sees when they hear a story like this. The genuine effort that came before the strategy. The years of trying to belong before I understood that I was never going to be allowed to. The strategy only started because everything else had already ended. That's the thing about being underestimated. It happens, mostly, to people who are trying very hard to be seen in a particular way, as warm, as accommodating, as not a threat. And when it becomes clear that none of that is going to work, you have a choice. You can keep trying. Or you can become, quietly and methodically and completely, exactly what they should have worried about from the beginning. I picked up my bag on the way out of the boardroom. I walked past my father-in-law without pausing. My attorney fell in to step beside me in the hallway, and she said softly, "How are you feeling?" I thought about it honestly. "Ready," I said. "I feel ready." And I walked out into the morning with the dry cleaning tag still in my collar, and I didn't look back once. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that boardroom. Not the legal mechanics of it, not the equity schedules or the conversion notices, but the human thing underneath all of it. The chairman laughed at me because he had spent 5 years watching me accommodate. He had watched me step back from my career without visible resistance. He had watched me sit through dinners and absorb comments and ask polite questions about the business while appearing to contribute nothing to the answers. He had drawn a conclusion from all of that. And his conclusion was reasonable given the evidence he had allowed himself to see. The problem was that he had never once considered the evidence he hadn't looked for. That's the thing about dismissing people. It feels like efficiency. It feels like you're saving time by not taking certain individuals seriously, by filing them away under a category and moving on. But what you're actually doing is choosing to be uninformed. You're deciding, actively, that you already know what you need to know. And that decision closes off the part of your mind that stays curious, stays watchful, stays honest about what's in front of you. I am not a naturally patient person. I want to be clear about that. The 2 years I spent watching and waiting were not comfortable for me. There were nights I wanted to walk into the chairman's office and put the forensic report on his desk and say something sharp and permanent. The restraint was a choice I made over and over, not a quality I was born with. And what made it possible was something my mother had given me without ever framing it as a lesson. The understanding that feelings are real but timing is a skill, and that acting from anger is almost always less effective than acting from preparation. Stuart once told me I was overthinking. I have turned that sentence over in my mind many times since then, and what strikes me now is not the dismissal. It's the assumption behind it. He assumed that his father's 30 years of experience made the numbers I'd noticed irrelevant. He assumed that institutional knowledge trumped analytical observation. He was wrong, but more than that, He had stopped being curious. He had inherited a worldview along with the company, and he wore it the way you wear something that fits well enough that you stop noticing it's there. I think about the dry cleaning tag in my collar. I left it there because I genuinely did not care what they thought of my blazer. But afterward, it became something else to me. A reminder that the things people overlook about you are not weaknesses unless you decide they are. The second-hand blazer was real. The thrift store was real. My mother's balance sheets were real. None of it was a disadvantage. It was just the shape of my actual life. And my actual life had given me something that no amount of family money or inherited confidence had given the people sitting across that table. The habit of paying close attention to things that other people had decided didn't matter. That habit is what I'd call intelligence in the truest sense. Not the kind measured by credentials, but the kind built by staying genuinely curious about what's actually true, even when the truth is inconvenient, even when noticing it costs you something, and the courage to act on what you find, slowly, carefully, without announcing it. That's not coldness. That's integrity of a particular kind. It's the refusal to be moved off what you know is right by pressure or comfort, or the desire to be liked by people who have already decided what category you belong in. I walked out of that boardroom and I didn't look back. Not because I wasn't affected, but because everything I needed from that room I had already taken with me.